Hi, I'm Brett Hammond. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to comment on these great papers. And more generally, thanks to the Pension Research Council for creating the kind of atmosphere where these kinds of discussions and these kinds of topics can be explored. Let's see. Good. So I was trying to think about how do you comment on three diverse papers, all of which are terrific, but all of which are going off in different directions. But what I started remembering is that this is a session on policy perspectives. And so what I thought I'd do is take two slides and talk a little bit about, in a more synthetic way, before being more specific about these papers. But this is sort of inspired by the papers. And we're kind of at the end of the conference, or near the end of the conference, so we really want to think about policy perspectives. Not that the Pension Research Council is in the business of advocating for anything, but what are the perspectives that get raised, or the questions that get raised that ought to be answered, or maybe even not answered by public policy. And of course, the big one is, so what? If we see a rise in debt, what does it mean? What is the role of debt in consumption smoothing and so forth? And the question, is it a problem? We've already heard that debt can, that there's a whole literature or an argument that says that debt is part of a reflection of improvements in the financial system, helping the financial system work. We've also said it could be bad, through over-leveraged economy, rises in bankruptcy, ability of the elderly to manage at the household level, so you get macro and micro issues arising. The macro observation, of course, is that we see debt everywhere all the time now, and it isn't just households. I think one of the big perspectives here is that businesses and governments have taken advantage of opportunities to increase debt, and they have all over the world. So what does that mean, and what is the relationship between household debt and business debt and government debt in a macro sense, and how much of it is secular versus cyclical? We've seen comments on that. The great experiment in 2009. The Great Recession. There's also the balloon theory. You have debt gets bigger and bigger as we inject debt into this balloon, and then we say, oh, there might be a problem over here, so let's push on that part of the balloon. Well, the balloon doesn't get the volume doesn't get any smaller; it just pushes the problem somewhere else, and that may be part of an issue here too. Another one is the composition of debtors, where we've seen questions about low income. Or low wealth, or the young, or particular cohorts, or gender, or ethnicity, and so we've seen some of that. And are there specific issues that are associated with any of those kinds of groups? And what are the I'll get to causal stuff in a second. The composition of debt, of course, at least at the household level, house, student debt, credit card debt. What are the characteristics of those, and how are they the same and different? Causal connections. What happens when you see a sea change, rising house prices, falling wages, or cohort effects? Is debt less onerous? Does debt cause work? Does work cause debt? This is the reverse causality, or a third intervening variable issue, and the generational divide in causal connections. And how much is the debt issue a byproduct of other policy issues and solutions? And I don't think they stuck in. They didn't stick in some of my slides, but that's okay. How much of debt is a byproduct of other policy issues and solutions? Well, let me give you an example. We all think home ownership is good, right? And that's been a policy through most of the 20th century in the U.S. and in other countries. In the U.S., there's been a big shift in home ownership patterns. We also know that there was a lot of pressure on, say, Freddie and Fannie in the U.S. Before 2009 to increase home ownership, and then they got yelled at for increasing home ownership at the same time. But let me go back even further and say that before the 1930s, and actually the behavior lasted after the 1930s when the policies began to change about home ownership. But the pattern was quite different. In the middle class, the pattern was if you can, you buy a house to raise your family. Then, when the family's gone, you sell the house and rent. That was the common pattern. In fact, I first started understanding this when I realized that's what my grandparents did, and it was a pattern to get rid of the house once your family was gone. Not everywhere, not all the time, but it was very much a trend. And the debt crisis of the 1930s, where you had 5-year rollover mortgages, balloon mortgages, the rise of the 30-year mortgage is a government policy, and which deeply affects debt, but it's being done for other purposes to create a home ownership culture and to create stability in the financial system. So note the role of government here. So and today we think about student loans and where is that coming from, and it's policy, it's debt policy, but made for other purposes. So. So policy considerations. I have 3 areas, of course, and they're not going to be surprising. There's education, so general financial literacy, specific education and training with respect to debt. Second area is policies for specific types of debt, the role of housing, student loans, credit card, of course. And then overall, what we've heard from this group today, effective financial regulation can play a big role. Or at least there's some evidence that that's true cross-nationally, and also macroprudential policies. So, should we get rid of the Consumer Financial Protection Board, or even change its name? I think they're trying to do that, to start with a B instead of a C. But there's some evidence that policies like this can be effective. And so and again, maybe not only for debt purposes, but the complication is, how do you make debt policy when there are other goals involved as well? So let me just where am I? Yep, the papers. Okay, so we have 3 diverse papers here, and the issue is 2 of them talk about debt, and the other one talks about the needs for savings, although there are implications for debt. Specifically on debt, I think the incidence and value of household debt is rising, and less clearly across the income and wealth spectrum. Those with higher debt work longer, particularly, and this is particularly sensitive to changes in dollar changes in credit card debt. Although I wonder if this is really about monthly flows as opposed to the size of the debt itself, and that's why you see it in dollar terms and not in percentage terms. Student debt is a higher percentage among lower wealth households and has a larger effect there. And then at the macro level, increases in debt to GDP are positive in the short run, negative at 3 to 5 years, but can be mitigated by good regulation and other public policies. Well, so what are the issues? It's important but impossible to understand, maybe impossible to understand what's driving longer work. Maybe we should look at some measure of debt surprises, 2008 and 2009 as a natural experiment. And maybe we actually should encourage debt if it makes people work longer in countries where the working population is declining or about to. So, and at the macro level, would we prefer a household debt increase compared to a government debt increase? I think we haven't really talked about that much in this conference, but the question is, what's the composition of debt at a macro sense, and do we prefer government to household debt, or not much of either, or a lot of both? Okay, last bit. Where am I? There. No, it's not letting me change. So on savings, we had a paper on savings, and by looking at different, arguably more accurate ways to measure income, Social Security can replace a very high percentage, or at least it seems it can replace a very high percentage of income for low-income workers. So maybe low-income workers, we don't need to worry about outside savings quite as much as we do for other layers of wealth and income. One lesson from all of this is that, like savings, rising debt and certain types of debt may be an issue for some groups and not others. Again, think of student loans and lower income folks. So debt is not necessarily monotonically associated with age or income or anything else. Makes it a little more complicated and difficult to deal with. Okay, issues and questions. What's the right way to measure Social Security wages? Another one is low-income workers are more likely to have income variability and interruptions, Andrew and I talked about this, than higher-income workers. how much effect does this have on replacement rates? And maybe not much, but maybe some. We'd like to see some discussion of that. Low-income retirees are less likely to purchase supplemental health insurance coverage and to suffer from higher morbidity. However, they're more likely to have access to nursing care through Medicaid. So in other words, what is the role of other kinds of income support or expenses for low-income workers that might make them different from others that would either enhance or exacerbate their issues with respect to savings and debt? And finally, what about rising debt among low-income workers? It'd be interesting to see a discussion of the issue about savings versus debt among low-income workers in all of this. So, in sum, I think this conference has got an enormous set or important set of policy implications and considerations. We're not here to debate the existence of the Consumer Financial Protection Board in the U.S. or anywhere else, but I think it has important implications for the role of regulation and at the national level and elsewhere, especially since many of the things that we've been talking about have been important policy considerations. Home ownership is a good thing, et cetera, that interact with the debt problem. And so I'll stop there, and I guess we can open it up for questions. Thank you very much.